In the cold, sealed atmosphere of the Kremlin in mid-December 1941, Joseph Stalin was already living inside a world of converging emergencies when the news arrived that Adolf Hitler had formally declared war on the United States. Moscow had survived the first German assault by the narrowest of margins only days earlier, with Soviet armies still locked in brutal winter fighting along the outskirts of the capital, and the leadership was operating on a rhythm of exhaustion, suspicion, and constant crisis. Reports flowed into Stalin's office at all hours, delivered by aides, NKVD couriers, and military liaisons, each document layered with the weight of potential catastrophe. Yet this message, coming through diplomatic and intelligence channels on December 11th, carried a significance that went beyond the immediate battlefield. It marked the sudden collapse of the last remaining illusion that the war might remain geographically compartmentalized. For Stalin, the German decision was not simply a dramatic gesture of ideological solidarity with Japan. It was a structural shift in the global balance of power. Until that moment, the Soviet Union had been fighting a desperate, largely solitary war against the main weight of the German army. Britain was an ally, but one constrained by distance and limited by its own strategic priorities. The United States, though already supplying material through Lend-Lease and shadowing the Atlantic War, remained formally outside the European conflict. Hitler's declaration removed that ambiguity in a single stroke, converting what had been a precarious coalition of convenience into an unavoidable military alignment between Moscow, London, and Washington. Stalin received the news with the same guarded stillness that characterized most moments of consequence in his rule. Those who later reconstructed the scene described no outburst of relief or triumph, only a measured attention to what the declaration meant in practical terms. He understood immediately that Germany had just created a new enemy with industrial and demographic resources that dwarfed those of any European power. American shipyards, steel mills, and aircraft factories were not abstractions to him. They were potential extensions of the Soviet war effort, capable of sustaining an industrialized conflict on a scale that Germany could not match. Yet Stalin was also aware that this transformation would not be instantaneous. The Red Army was still bleeding at an enormous rate, and the next German offensives were already being planned. The timing mattered. Pearl Harbor had occurred only days earlier, on December 7th, and Stalin had followed those developments with intense interest, recognizing that the Japanese attack had forced the United States into war in the Pacific. Hitler's decision to follow Japan into a global conflict now bound Germany's fate to a confrontation with the full weight of American power. In Stalin's strategic calculus, this reduced the likelihood of any separate peace between Germany and the Western powers, a fear that had haunted him since 1941 began. The Soviet leadership had never entirely trusted Britain to remain committed if the war in the East turned irreversibly bleak. A formal German-American war made such a diplomatic escape far more difficult. Inside the Kremlin, the declaration also intersected with Stalin's own psychology. The German invasion in June had been a profound personal shock, shattering years of cautious maneuvering and forcing him into a war he had hoped to delay. By December, he was no longer paralyzed by disbelief, but he remained acutely aware of how close the Soviet state had come to collapse. Hitler's move, reckless as it was, suggested to Stalin that the German leadership was operating under a dangerous mix of ideological certainty and strategic overreach. It was a sign that Berlin was willing to gamble on total war rather than seek a narrower victory in the East. The news did not end Soviet vulnerability, but it altered the horizon of possibility. From that moment, Stalin could begin to think not only in terms of survival but of eventual strategic convergence with two other major powers whose interests were now irreversibly tied to Germany's defeat. The war had ceased to be a brutal contest between a beleaguered continental empire and an invading coalition. It had become a global struggle in which time, production, and alliance politics would slowly begin to favor Moscow. Stalin absorbed this reality in silence, already calculating how this new configuration might be exploited, even as Soviet soldiers continued to die in the frozen fields outside their capital. Stalin's first instinct was not to dwell on the drama of Hitler's announcement but to translate it into a cold assessment of power, resources, and time. For him, war was never an abstract clash of ideologies but a competition between systems of production and political endurance, and in December 1941 the Soviet Union was still fighting for its own survival. German armies remained deep inside Soviet territory, and although the immediate threat to Moscow had been blunted, the Red Army was exhausted, its reserves fragile, and its logistical system stretched close to collapse. Against that backdrop, the entry of the United States into open war with Germany did not promise quick salvation, but it reshaped the strategic geometry in a way Stalin immediately recognized as decisive over the long term. The most important shift lay in the industrial dimension of the conflict. The United States was not merely another combatant, it was the largest integrated industrial economy in the world, with an unmatched capacity to produce ships, aircraft, vehicles, and raw materials at scale. Stalin understood this because Soviet planning itself was rooted in the idea that modern war was determined less by individual battles than by the sustained ability to replace losses and expand production under pressure. Germany, despite its early successes, was already straining to equip its armies across a vast front. By bringing the United States fully into the war, Hitler had ensured that Germany would now face an adversary whose productive output, when mobilized, would eventually dwarf anything the Reich could assemble. At the same time, Stalin was acutely aware that American power would not be felt immediately on the Eastern Front. He had no illusions about rapid U.S. troop deployments or instant military relief. The United States would need time to train armies, convert factories, and organize the enormous logistical machinery required for global war. Yet even this delay had meaning in his calculations. If the Soviet Union could simply endure, holding its lines through 1942 and beyond, the cumulative weight of American industry would begin to press against Germany from the west, the air, and the oceans. This prospect transformed the war from a desperate struggle for Soviet survival into a long contest of attrition that increasingly favored those with deeper economic reserves. There was also a political dimension that Stalin grasped with equal clarity. Hitler's declaration erased any remaining space for a diplomatic rearrangement between Germany and the Western powers. Before December 1941, Stalin had worried that Britain, isolated and exhausted, might one day be tempted to negotiate a compromise peace that would leave the Soviet Union alone against the Reich. With the United States now formally at war with Germany, that possibility receded sharply. Washington and London were now bound to Berlin's defeat in a way that could not be easily undone without catastrophic loss of credibility and power. For Stalin, this meant that the coalition against Germany, however fragile or distrustful its members might be, had become structurally locked in. This shift also affected how he viewed Japan. The Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact with Tokyo in April 1941, and Stalin was determined to avoid a two-front war. Hitler's alignment with Japan did not automatically invalidate that agreement, but it created new pressures inside the Axis camp. Stalin interpreted this as a further complication for Germany, which now had to consider not only the vastness of the Eastern Front but the strategic entanglements of its partners. Even the possibility that American forces would focus on the Pacific rather than Europe still worked to Moscow's advantage by diverting Axis resources and attention away from the Soviet struggle. Underlying all of this was Stalin's sense that Hitler had revealed something dangerous about his own strategic judgment. Declaring war on the United States while already locked in a massive, unresolved campaign against the Soviet Union suggested a leadership willing to gamble on total ideological confrontation rather than manage risk. Stalin had built his own power through ruthless calculation and incremental control, and he recognized recklessness when he saw it. From his perspective, Germany had just chosen to expand the war at precisely the moment when it should have been consolidating its gains. None of this diminished the immediate peril facing the Soviet state, but it altered the trajectory of that peril. The war was no longer only a test of whether the Red Army could stop the Wehrmacht. It was becoming a global system in which time, industry, and alliance politics would gradually erode Germany's initial advantages. Stalin absorbed this reality without outward emotion, already adjusting his expectations and priorities to a conflict that, while still terrifyingly uncertain, now contained the faint outline of a future in which Soviet endurance could be rewarded by the slow, relentless pressure of a much larger coalition. Within the upper layers of the Soviet state, the news that the United States had entered the war against Germany moved through a tightly controlled but intensely charged political environment. The State Defense Committee, the Politburo, and the General Staff had been operating for months under the assumption that the Soviet Union was carrying the main weight of the struggle against the Reich, with Britain acting as a distant but unreliable partner. The formal entry of the United States altered that framework in a way that could not be ignored, and it immediately became the subject of careful, often cautious discussion among Stalin's closest lieutenants. Men such as Vyacheslav Molotov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Georgy Zhukov did not treat the development as a moment for celebration, but as a new variable in a system already defined by extreme uncertainty. In the Foreign Commissariat, Molotov recognized that the declaration created an opening that had not existed before. Soviet diplomats had spent much of 1941 trying to bind Britain more tightly to Moscow through formal agreements and military coordination, while quietly probing Washington for material support. Now those separate tracks converged. The United States was no longer a sympathetic but detached supplier, It was a belligerent power whose fate was directly linked to the outcome of the European War. This gave the Soviet leadership greater leverage in its dealings with both London and Washington, even if that leverage would have to be exercised with restraint. The Kremlin understood that alliance politics were shaped not by goodwill but by necessity, and the necessity had just deepened. Inside the security apparatus, Beria and the NKVD viewed the shift through a different lens. American entry into the war increased the volume and complexity of foreign contact, intelligence exchanges, and diplomatic traffic flowing into and out of Moscow. That meant both opportunity and danger. The Soviet system was built on the assumption that external alliances always carried the risk of infiltration, manipulation, and hidden agendas. While American hostility toward Germany aligned with Soviet interests, it did not erase the ideological gulf between communism and Western capitalism. For Beria's organization, the task was to extract as much material and intelligence value as possible from the new partnership while preventing any erosion of internal control. In the military sphere, the reaction was equally guarded. The Red Army was in the midst of a grueling winter campaign, and its commanders were acutely aware that no foreign ally could substitute for Soviet divisions holding the line. Yet among officers such as Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the prospect of sustained American production and eventual military engagement introduced a new strategic horizon. It suggested that Germany would, over time, be forced to divert resources to confront threats beyond the Eastern Front, even if those threats were initially indirect. This did not change operational planning in the short term, but it influenced how Soviet commanders thought about the length and shape of the war they were now fighting. There was also a quieter psychological effect within the leadership. The Soviet Union had entered the conflict in isolation, distrusted by the West and feared by its neighbors, and that isolation had been brutally exposed in the first months of the German invasion. The entry of the United States did not eliminate suspicion, but it reduced the sense that the Soviet state was alone against a hostile world. Even for men who expected betrayal as a matter of course, the alignment of three major powers against a single enemy created a different emotional climate, one in which endurance seemed more plausible than annihilation. Yet no one in Stalin's circle mistook alignment for friendship. Memories of Western intervention during the Russian Civil War and years of diplomatic hostility were still vivid. The American decision was interpreted not as an act of solidarity with socialism but as a response to its own strategic shock at Pearl Harbor and to Hitler's own recklessness. This realism shaped how the Soviet leadership spoke about the new ally, both in private and in public statements. The language of cooperation was carefully calibrated, emphasizing common enemies rather than shared values. In this atmosphere, the sudden presence of the United States in the war did not bring relief so much as a recalibration of risk. It offered the possibility that Germany would now face pressures it could not indefinitely sustain, but it also introduced a powerful new actor whose post-war intentions were unknown and potentially threatening. The Soviet leadership absorbed this contradiction with the same disciplined caution that defined its response to every external force, already preparing to navigate a coalition that promised both survival and a new set of dangers. For the Soviet leadership, the sudden expansion of the war to include the United States forced a subtle but profound revision of how Germany's future was imagined. Until December 1941, even after the failure of Operation Barbarossa to achieve a quick victory, the Reich still appeared as a terrifyingly efficient war machine, capable of concentrating immense force and exploiting the industrial resources of occupied Europe. The Soviet Union had survived the first blow, but survival did not yet imply eventual triumph. In Stalin's private calculations and in the internal assessments circulated among the General Staff and the State Defense Committee, the central question had been whether Germany could be worn down before Soviet manpower and industrial relocation collapsed under the strain. Hitler's decision to provoke a global confrontation shifted that equation. Germany was now committed to a form of total war that its economic and strategic position made increasingly unsustainable. The Reich had been built for rapid, decisive campaigns on the European continent, not for a prolonged struggle against multiple industrial giants operating on different continents. Soviet analysts understood this with clarity born of their own experience of mobilizing a command economy for war. They knew how quickly even the most efficient system could be exhausted when production had to keep pace with expanding fronts, mounting losses, and growing logistical complexity. The addition of the United States to the enemy coalition meant that Germany would now face, sooner or later, a steady flood of material and manpower that could not be neutralized by battlefield skill alone. This did not lead to complacency in Moscow. On the contrary, it sharpened the sense that time had become the central strategic variable. Germany still held vast territories, controlled crucial resources, and possessed an army that had not yet been decisively defeated. But the long-term trajectory of the war had begun to tilt. Soviet planners, accustomed to thinking in 5-year plans and production quotas, now saw Germany's prospects through a similar lens. Every month that the Reich failed to achieve a decisive result increased the relative weight of its opponents, whose combined industrial output was now far greater than its own. The psychological dimension of this shift was equally important. Hitler's gamble revealed a leadership that was no longer acting purely on military calculation but was increasingly driven by ideological compulsion and overconfidence. From the Soviet point of view, this made German strategy more dangerous in the short term but less coherent in the long term. A state that widened its list of enemies while still locked in a brutal war of survival in the East was taking on commitments that even a disciplined system would struggle to fulfill. The Soviet leadership had no illusions about Hitler's willingness to fight to the end, but they now believed that the structural foundations of German power were being stretched beyond their limits. This altered how future scenarios were imagined inside the Kremlin. Instead of asking whether Germany might eventually force a negotiated settlement through sheer endurance, planners began to consider the conditions under which the Reich would be driven into irreversible decline. The war was increasingly seen not as a race between two exhausted armies, but as a contest between an expanding coalition and a coalition that had reached its natural ceiling. Even if Germany continued to win battles, its strategic space for recovery was shrinking. Yet this new outlook was always tempered by the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Soviet losses remained catastrophic, and the Red Army would have to do most of the fighting against the Wehrmacht for years to come. The expectation that Germany would eventually be overwhelmed by superior resources did not reduce the urgency of immediate survival. Instead, it imposed a different kind of discipline, the understanding that every mile held, every factory rebuilt east of the Urals, and every division preserved contributed not just to the next campaign but to a long war whose ultimate balance was beginning to look more favorable. In this way, the entry of the United States did not create a sudden sense of victory in Moscow, but it changed the horizon of defeat. Germany was no longer viewed as an enemy whose power might remain essentially intact if it avoided catastrophic mistakes. It was now seen as a state that had chosen a path of overextension, binding its fate to a global struggle it was structurally ill-equipped to win. That recognition, quiet and unsentimental, became part of the Soviet understanding of how the war would ultimately unfold. For Stalin, the declaration of war by Germany against the United States required an immediate and careful recalibration of how alliances would be managed and exploited in the months and years ahead. He had never treated coalitions as moral commitments. They were instruments to be used as long as they served Soviet survival and advantage. The entry of the United States transformed what had been an awkward partnership with Britain into a triangular relationship whose internal tensions could be manipulated as much as its combined strength could be harnessed. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union's value as a battlefield ally had just increased, because it was now the principal force tying down the bulk of the German army while the Western powers mobilized. This gave him leverage. Every German division destroyed in the East reduced the burden that American and British forces would eventually have to face elsewhere, and Stalin was acutely aware that this fact would shape diplomatic negotiations. He began to see the Red Army not only as a shield for Soviet territory but as a bargaining chip in a broader strategic exchange. Requests for material, shipping, and technical assistance could now be framed not as charity but as a necessary investment in a common struggle. The logic was brutally simple. If the Western powers wanted the Soviet Union to continue absorbing the main shock of German power, they would have to pay for it in trucks, aircraft, fuel, and food. At the same time, Stalin remained deeply suspicious of Western intentions. He had not forgotten the pattern of earlier decades, when Britain and the United States had oscillated between hostility and uneasy cooperation toward the Soviet state. The new alliance did not erase the possibility that the Western powers might, at some future moment, attempt to shape the post-war order in ways that limited Soviet influence. As a result, his recalculation was not only about defeating Germany but about positioning the Soviet Union for the political landscape that would follow that defeat. Military coordination was necessary, but independence of action was still essential. Strategically, this meant that Stalin was prepared to commit enormous Soviet resources to the war against Germany while simultaneously preserving the Red Army's role as an autonomous force, not subordinate to Western planning. He had no intention of allowing British or American leaders to dictate Soviet operations on the Eastern Front. Instead, he would present Soviet offensives as contributions to a shared effort while ensuring that their timing and objectives served Soviet priorities first. The presence of a powerful new ally made this balancing act more complex, but it also made it more valuable, because the stakes of misalignment were now much higher. The alliance also influenced how Stalin thought about geographic priorities. With the United States now engaged on a global scale, the war was no longer confined to the Eurasian landmass. Control of shipping lanes, access to raw materials, and the movement of industrial goods across oceans became part of the strategic picture. Stalin did not command a blue water navy, but he understood that American and British control of the seas could be turned into a force multiplier for the Soviet war effort if managed correctly. Securing steady flows of supplies from abroad became as important as holding territory at home. Yet this recalculation never softened Stalin's underlying worldview. He continued to assume that every partner was also a potential rival, and that today's ally could become tomorrow's obstacle. The difference after December 1941 was that the Western powers now had a direct, irreversible interest in Germany's destruction, which aligned, for the moment, with Soviet survival. That alignment created space for cooperation, but not for trust. In this environment, Stalin adjusted his wartime strategy to operate on two parallel tracks. One was the relentless, grinding military campaign against the Wehrmacht, aimed at preserving Soviet territory and inflicting irreversible damage on German forces. The other was a diplomatic and economic campaign designed to extract maximum support from Britain and the United States while preparing for a future in which their interests might diverge from Moscow's. The declaration of war had not simplified the geopolitical landscape. It had made it denser, more crowded, and more dangerous. Stalin's response was to move within that complexity with the same calculating discipline that had defined his rule, turning a sudden global shift into another arena in which power could be accumulated and preserved. The significance of Germany's decision to bring the United States into the war extended far beyond diplomatic symbolism, reaching into the structural logic that governed how the Eastern Front and the wider conflict would unfold. From that point forward, the war in the East was no longer an isolated struggle between two continental empires locked in a fight for survival. It became the central pillar of a global confrontation in which the outcome would be shaped not only by armies in the field but by the interaction of multiple industrial systems, alliance networks, and political calculations operating on a planetary scale. For the Soviet Union, this meant that every kilometer of territory held or regained now carried weight far beyond its immediate military value, because it influenced how long Germany could remain a coherent fighting power. On the Eastern Front, the German army would continue to fight with ferocity, but it would do so under increasingly constrained conditions. Even as new offensives were planned, Berlin now had to account for the reality that its enemies were multiplying and coordinating. Resources that might once have been concentrated against the Red Army would, over time, have to be diverted to air defense, naval construction, and preparations for eventual confrontation with American and British forces. This gradual diffusion of German power did not change the brutality of the fighting in the East, but it altered the strategic ceiling of what the Wehrmacht could achieve. Victories could still be won, but they would become harder to translate into a decisive outcome. For the Soviet side, this created a new kind of strategic patience. The Red Army still had to survive and rebuild, but it no longer had to imagine that it was facing a self-contained opponent whose full strength would remain permanently focused on the Soviet Union. The war became a contest of endurance in which Soviet losses, however immense, were being balanced against an enemy whose strategic position was eroding even when it appeared to advance. This did not make the future safe, but it made it intelligible in a way it had not been during the dark months of 1941. The wider war was equally transformed. The Atlantic and Pacific theaters, once peripheral to the struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union, were now part of a single, interconnected system. Decisions taken in Washington about shipbuilding, aircraft production, and troop deployment would eventually shape what happened in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. This interdependence meant that no single front could be fully understood in isolation. The fate of German armies outside Moscow was now tied, however indirectly, to factories in Detroit and shipyards in California. This moment also imposed a new logic on alliance politics. The coalition opposing Germany was no longer a temporary alignment of convenience, but a structure that would have to be sustained through years of sacrifice. That reality increased both the strength and the fragility of the partnership. Shared enemies created powerful incentives for cooperation, but the scale of the undertaking guaranteed friction, competition, and mistrust. For the Soviet Union, operating within this environment meant fighting a war whose military and political dimensions were inseparable, where every operation on the Eastern Front reverberated through a web of diplomatic and economic relationships stretching across the globe. In this sense, the moment marked a turning point in the character of the conflict. The war ceased to be a series of regional crises and became a single, integrated struggle over the future distribution of power. The Eastern Front remained the largest and most lethal arena of that struggle, but it was now embedded within a broader framework that gave Soviet endurance a different meaning. Holding ground in the East was no longer only about preventing defeat. It was about buying time for a global system of pressure to come into effect. The lasting significance lay in this shift from isolation to entanglement. The Soviet Union was still fighting for its life, but it was now doing so in a world where Germany's enemies were no longer limited or loosely connected. The war's direction, on every front, had been set on a path where industrial capacity, alliance cohesion, and strategic patience would matter as much as battlefield brilliance. From that point forward, the fate of the Eastern Front was inseparable from the fate of the wider war, bound together by a single, irreversible expansion of the conflict.